Good morning. My name is Jorge Heine. I'm the interim director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. Dean Taylor cannot make it this morning, but he may well join us later in the course of the proceedings. I had lunch yesterday with Professor Erik Goldstein, going over the plans for this great conference. And well, we talked about the validity of the old saw. Timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. Erik tells me that when he and Professor Nolan came up with the idea of putting together this conference some time ago, little did they know that by now it will be one of the main concerns of the on the international agenda, how to bring to an end the tragic war in Ukraine. I would thus like to welcome you to Boston University, the Pardee School, and the Pardee Center, and wish you productive and fruitful deliberations. I would like to thank Professors Goldstein and Nolan for coming up with this initiative on what turned out to be such a topical subject. I would also like to thank the past dean of the Pardee School, Adil Najam, and the current dean, Scott Taylor, for the support of the activities of the Pardee Center in general and for this conference in particular. I would be remiss not to mention the excellent work done by my colleague and friend, Professor John Woodward, in the organization of this conference, and that of John Pandato, Assistant Director of the Pardee Center, and making it happen. May you have fruitful proceedings. And if you will excuse me, unfortunately, I also have a day job. I now have to go and teach, but I'll be back later on. Thank you so much, and welcome to BU.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm John Woodward. I'm a professor of the practice of international relations here at the Pardee School of Global Studies. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to join us. We much appreciate your presence. The most important thing, there is coffee available in the back of the room. Please caffeinate yourselves. Professor Cathal Nolan was scheduled to give the introductory remarks. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here because of some logistical difficulties. So this is Plan B. I've been working very closely with my colleagues, Erik Goldstein and Cathal Nolan, in organizing this. And as Ambassador Hein mentioned, everyone thinks, oh, they came up with the How Wars End conference after Putin invaded Ukraine. Actually, not that we were prescient, but Professor Goldstein and Professor Nolan had planned this conference long in advance of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Admittedly, that invasion has given us some rich material, which will be discussed in a later panel to be moderated by my colleague, Ambassador Starella. But the conference was long in planning. We did receive support from Dean Emeritus Adil Najam in terms of providing resources that carried over with our new Dean, Scott Taylor. Has everyone had a chance to get the agenda sheet so you can see the game plan for today? We're going to try to adhere to this, right? A noble aspiration. And you can see there is a logic to the panels. We start with the historical perspective that the first panel will accomplish. Then we'll go to the Iraq War. We're very honored to have our moderator will be Shamron Mako, one of our colleagues at the Pardee School. And we have two people that are intimately familiar with that. Ambassador Al-Hakim, who many of you will know, served as a foreign minister in Iraq along with other portfolios, as well as Ambassador James Jeffrey, who is the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, as well as to Turkey and to other issue areas. We will have lunch provided. Lunch will be a modest sandwich and sundries. After lunch, we'll have a panel discussing how intelligence supports diplomats in ending wars. That will be moderated by my old CIA colleague, Joe Whipple. Now, in fairness, Joe Whipple rose a lot higher in the CIA than I ever did, but he'll be moderating that panel. Erik will be on that, and we'll be joined by Ambassador Simon, who is a diplomat, I think, hopefully relied on intelligence from time to time in your work. And then we'll go to a panel on the Afghanistan war that I'll be moderating with Thomas Barfield, one of the experts on Afghanistan, and Christine Fair, who'll be zooming in from Georgetown University due to some scheduling difficulties that she's had, both tremendous experts on South Asia. We'll then go to our last panel, which will be how current crises end, and that's where we'll talk about all the rest. Okay, so that is the game plan. Erik will give us our concluding remarks, and I guess Erik, in a way, you're the alpha and the omega. You're going to be the first panel, and you will get the final words.
All right, this symposium, just very quickly, this symposium originated in a long-standing interest of the International History Institute in the diplomacy of war and peace, among many other issues it dealt with. Very quickly, research on how peace transitions to war is extensive. Books about the origins of wars fill shelves, both paper and digital. Ask your students if you're a teacher. They have all heard, I hesitate to say read, boilerplate explanations of the origins of World War I. And then they immediately jump to how the war ended, and they just really hear Versailles. Far less is known about how wars transition back to peace. Knowledge of how warring parties are getting to go about getting to peace is sharply limited by excessive social science abstraction, or historians who assume the uniqueness of time, place, and conflict, which is all well and good, it's true, but please tell us how it fits the wider world as well. Peace is not an abstraction, nor is a negotiating process reinvented every time. Peace is made in face-to-face talks by real people who must set aside wartime hatred to reach a halt to conflicts that led to the war in the first place. They have to struggle toward a compromise deal in the face of ongoing bloodshed, fractured leadership, and aroused populations. They must agree to concessions while fighting and killing is still underway, usually accelerating as a final deal approaches and both leadership groups seek to maximize their negotiating advantage to get to the final talks table. While fighting is still happening, it almost seems impossible to negotiate a peace agreement. And yet, every war comes to an end. Or at least it sputters out while we recover, rearm, and get ready to do it all over again. I would argue, and have done so at book length, that most wars do not lead back to peace. They enter a pause of exhaustion, and then they start up all over again. Historians and sometimes contemporaries name the active bits. We call them wars, as if they had truly discrete causes, outcomes, or solutions. The medieval 100 Years' War, and I have to say there were at least a dozen 100 Years' Wars in history, in Europe, in Japan, in the Middle East. There was another 100 Years' War, which finally ended in the forced unification of Japan in 1615, rare case of both exhaustion and decisive victory. The worldwide wars that stretched from the time of Louis XIV through Napoleon are really best understood as another 100 Years' War, about 140 years in length, for global primacy between the British and French empires. Yet we call them a dozen names in the history books. The Dutch War, the 9 Years. This is all the same war. The Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the wars of the Spanish Succession, the Bavarian Succession, the Austrian Succession, an argument against monarchy. 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, the wars of the Fifth through the Sixth coalitions against France and Napoleon. What about the 80 Years' War? Again, you should ask me, which one am I talking about? The long wars of the Spanish Empire that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Philippines, or the modern 80 Years' War between Israel and the Arab states. And wait 20 more years, and we have another 100 Years' War. How about the 30 Years' War? Do I mean 1618 to 1648, including 4 years of fighting while still talking at at Westphalia? Or do I mean 1914 to 1945, the interconnected German war of the 20th century? Or do I mean 1919 to 2021? 1991 to 2021. Do wars end in a decisive military victory? Almost none, but yet we seem to think that's what we want and that's what we expect, and that's when we'll get back to peace. Almost none. Yet ever since World War II ended that way, we think all wars should end that way. But in fact, World War I is the more accurate model, and that it simply led to another larger phase. Do wars end via a ceasefire agreed among the belligerents? Some do. How about a settlement mediated by a third party? Some do. How do you get to the point of being accepting a third party, and which third party? What are the successful preconditions to mediation beyond exhaustion? How do you get from a ceasefire to a full peace treaty that locks in a genuine compromise over terms of settlement? I can talk faster.
No, you have time.
Okay. All right.
You have another 10 minutes.
I won't need 10 minutes. Give me 5. This conference asks, how do warring parties get to peace while a war is still underway? For the vast majority of wars, I would say nearly all of them, in fact, do not end in a decisive military victory where one side marches into the enemy's capital, plants its flags, and dictates terms. It's largely myth. And even then, it doesn't work very often. Most wars simply peter into attrition often not leading to anything more than a prolonged ceasefire when both sides stumble to exhaustion, a fresh outbreak of fighting 10 years or 20 years later when they have rearmed and rested and re-engaged with another generation of young men, and now today also young women. But sometimes, and this is what really interests us today, warring parties are so mutually exhausted that they finally recognize compromise as preferable to any further marginal military gains that they might make on the battlefield when the war has in fact begun to descend into nihilism, when the war has become a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. We usually go on fighting for quite some time, even after we realize that is our new reality. For war has a terrible inertia that we enter, build, and wage it without breaks. We're usually stopped rather than choose to stop. We will likely argue over several major explanations for this phenomenon, but one thing I am personally sure about is the answer does not lie, and this is one of the things Erik and I definitely agreed on when we put this thing together in the proposal stage several years ago before COVID interrupted. The answer does not lie in statistics, in charts, and in models. It resides in human contact. It resides in muting anger while sitting across a negotiation table, daring solutions proposed by leaders who have decided to somehow end the fighting and get back to peace, maybe risking their own political or even physical lives to do so. And on both sides, it takes at least two to make war or to make peace. We must set this extraordinarily hard process of talking while fighting inside other key factors that influence how we get back to peace, whether it is merely by stumbling from exhaustion that we just can't continue the war, or genuine compromise solutions that actually lead to some kind of permanent resolution of the disputes that made us kill each other in the first place. How do we move from military engagement over territory or ideology or nationalism, that's the big one, to reduction of our declared war aims, and then to face-to-face talks? How do we do it? How do we lower the political rage that results from the war itself? Because the first blood spilled, the first treasure spent, changes everything, or most things. Forcing leaders to justify all of it to the weeping mothers in their home country would talk about, and put it all in quotation marks, sacrifice, and stay the course, final victory, that almost never comes. And yet somehow, every time, we do manage to get back to some peace, or at least a simulacrum of peace, as the sides agree on partial but also workable confidence-building measures that reduce and finally end active fighting, and then from there maybe we can inch forward, inch forward, inch forward. Most historians, who I have to say do not study war at all these days, fail to understand this key fact about war. It is why they teach their students the origins of wars and then the outcomes of wars, overlooking all the middle bits. And I've tested every class of students. How are you taught at World War I? Origins of World War I, Paris Peace Conference. What happened in the middle? Do you think that mattered? Do you think it actually mattered that it raised the passions of every nation in Europe, engaged them for 4 years of bloodshed, took 10 million lives? You don't think that affected the peace talks? Paris? Look at the war aims that people declare at the beginning of a war. Look at the terms that are actually negotiated at the end. They have almost no relation to each other. Very seldom do they have a relation to each other. All the passion and death in the middle makes stopping so much harder than starting. We need to put the humanity back into the study of war if we want to get back to peace, even if only to a ceasefire, to gain time to cool down and then stop. And thank you. Okay, thanks. Sorry about the mass pike. It was like...
Thank you, Cathal. And there you actually have the context of how we started the debate that has led to this conference, and to look at some of these issues. And because the First World War, but events before the First World War and afterwards were part of the story that was just mentioned, we're going to start with a historical perspective, because sometimes when we're looking at very current issues, that bigger lens of pulling it back and seeing the bigger context we thought was an important starting point. So going to turn first, they've already been introduced, to Thomas Otte and then to Bruce Strang.
How you doing? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Right. Well,
Give to the audience, yeah.
may I start off by thanking the organisers for inviting me to this conference. I'm delighted to have been asked. Delighted to be in Boston, which is my favourite US city. But also, I'm delighted that the organisers have had they've denied this just now, but I think they had the foresight and the intellectual courage to organise a conference on the problem of how wars end. The topic is timely, of course. I think it's always timely, but it is perhaps especially timely at this particular moment. For as Clausewitz may or may not have said, we know how every war started, but no one knows how wars will end. So my remit is to offer some historical reflections on how wars ended. And really, it struck me as I was listening to Cathal, what I'm actually going to do is simply to offer a variation on a theme provided by Professor Nolan. I also have a sneaking suspicion that I was asked to speak here because my field of history, diplomatic or international history, has always been regarded as a kind of disaster studies. You know, something you don't study for its own sake, but rather you study it because it might, just might, give you some practical insights into contemporary problems. And my ambition here is more modest and perhaps also more ambitious. History can suggest ways in which contemporary problems can be analysed, and it can offer some analogies with past patterns. Historical insights can be applied, lessons can be learned, but, and this is a very significant but, it still leaves current and future generations free to make their own mistakes in the future. So that's my health warning to what follows. There's one preliminary observation, and again, Professor Nolan touched on this. Historians are well used to distinguishing between different types of wars that are specific to particular periods in history. Religious wars, or the wars of religion rather, wars of succession, the wars of nations, the total wars of the 20th century. Each of them reflect particular aspects of their particular period, and they reflect the nature of the evolving great power system. But by the same token, it seems to me that one can distinguish between different types of war endings. And these do not necessarily reflect the epochs in which the conflicts occurred, but they reflect rather more general characteristics. And I'm excluding here very deliberately de facto terminations of fighting which under international law do not constitute a formal end of war. That is, ceasefires, surrenders, preliminary peace agreements, and unilateral declarations in favor of ending a war. So bearing this caveat in mind, there are, I think, 5 broadly defined war endings. I will go through them quickly and then I will turn to them and try to develop them. The first one is the limited peace, adjusting the outcome of a war fought for limited objectives. Second, there is the temporary peace in a prolonged antagonistic relationship between states or groups of states punctuated by frequent conflict. So in effect, they're sort of de facto armistices. Third, there are the mediated peace settlements. Fourth, the hegemonial peace. And finally, fifth, the reordering of the international system. Now, I don't want to make any inflated claims about this typology. Its nomenclature is perhaps a trifle arbitrary, and the types are not rigidly demarcated. In practice, the boundaries between them may be found to be fluid, and one settlement may well fall into 2 or more categories. But really what I'm trying to do is here to concentrate minds, so this typology is merely meant to be a kind of working tool to serve heuristic purposes. Let me now turn to these types in turn. The limited peace. The limited peace is more typical of the 18th century, when wars tended to be fought for limited objectives even though their longer-term consequences were often very significant. The settlement of the Polish succession in 1738 is a case in point. No major military operations were conducted in the 3 preceding years, even though the war itself spread to 3 separate theaters of war. Its outbreak had been a failure of diplomacy. The death of Poland's Saxon king Augustus II could have been foreseen and the succession settled by a European Congress. The eventual settlement entailed an intricate minuet of dynastic and territorial shuffles that satisfied the principal parties to the conflict. But it was also the prelude to the later partitions of Poland that so troubled the 19th and 20th centuries, and it foreshadowed the so-called diplomatic revolution of 1756. Now, if this type is to be found more frequently in the period before the French Revolution, it is by no means confined to it. Limited wars in the lee of great power rivalries, such as the German-Danish War of 1864 and the subsequent Austro-Prussian clash in 1866, testify to this. In each case, Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian prime minister, the principal instigator behind the wars, succeeded in insulating each contest against diplomatic and military intervention by any of the other powers by terminating the war at the earliest opportunity and by limiting Prussia's gain. Each time there was enough unexploded ordnance left, mostly by design, to make another round of fighting with Prussia's principal adversaries possible, if not indeed necessary. In 1866, that was Austria, and 4 years later, in 1870, it was France. The history of international relations is rich in examples of the second type, the peace settlements that were little more than temporary arrangements between powers locked into a deep antagonism, often spanning a lengthy period of time. So they are de facto armistices to mark time while the parties involved arranged their affairs. One example is the Peace of Breda of 1667, which terminated the second of the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century. The Dutch had sailed into the Medway, the estuary of the Thames. They had sunk the English navy, and with that, the war could no longer be continued by England. English sea power had simply ceased to exist, and this made peace necessary. Breda brought to an end a miserable war, having entered it out of a mixture of economic aggression, political recklessness, and complacency. England emerged from it empty-handed. The legacy of Breda was nevertheless ambiguous. It was only, and I quote, a snarling peace, as Sir William Temple, the most accomplished of British diplomats of the period, called it. No doubt it intensified the commercial rivalry between England and the Netherlands, and so prepared the grounds for a third round of fighting. But already at Breda, the shadow of Louis XIV's ambitions on the Low Countries hung over the proceedings, and to that extent, the peace treaty marked a turning point in Anglo-Dutch relations, and it also helped to prepare the Dutch takeover of Britain in 1688. The wars between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans in southeastern Europe were similarly punctuated by such snarling arrangements. The Peace of Karlowitz of 1677, negotiated on neutralized ground, a sort of patch of territory alongside the Danube, 8 miles by 4 in size, and all diplomatic etiquette was dispensed. This treaty was the first victorious peace with the Turks since the Ottoman encroachment upon the Balkans had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier. It thus marked a watershed moment in the history of the Ottoman Empire, but also for great power politics. Substantial territorial gains for the Habsburgs outside Germany aside, it deprived French policy of that network of Eastern alliances that had provided vital cover for French advances towards the Rhine and other parts of Western Europe. And in the context of our discussions here, it is worth noting that the peace treaty was officially designated as an armisticium. They used Latin as their language of negotiation, and this armistice was to last for 25 years. Well, the next Austro-Turkish war came a lot sooner than that, already in 1716, and 2 further conflicts were to erupt until 1788. That to last, any peace settlement requires firm and stable foundations is underlined by the short-lived Anglo-French Peace of Amiens of 1802. It was made possible by British victories in the Baltic and the Mediterranean. Both sides were exhausted, and this paved the way for a compromise peace, though not without the interval of a brief resumption of hostilities. With hindsight, it is easy to say that this was a flawed peace, and indeed it was little more than a truce. Its defects were many. Principal among them was the fact that the newly created republics in the Low Countries in northern Italy and in Switzerland were nothing but French satellite states, and so this did not help to safeguard British interests, and indeed Amiens did nothing to contain French expansion, which continued, if not by war, then by diplomatic pressure. Having ignored the possibility of such developments, the British delayed the execution of their treaty obligations. They thus broke the letter of the treaty in response to Napoleon's breaking of its spirit. Fear of outside mediation was crucial to the 1779 Peace of Teschen, which brought to an end the Peace of the Bavarian Succession, which had essentially been brought about by rather high-handed moves by the Austrians, and which then involved Austria and Prussia in an exhausting war of endless maneuvers. A Russian démarche threatening military intervention on the side of Prussia brought the Austrians to the negotiating table. Carefully choreographed representations in Paris helped to amplify the pressure, and the timing here was also crucial. The troops of both parties had taken to their winter quarters. An armistice was easily arranged, and this gave diplomacy the time it needed to settle the Bavarian question and its attendant problems. Significantly, it also allowed Russia into the concert of Europe and made Russia the arbiter of German affairs. The fourth type of war endings, the hegemonial peace, is perhaps less common than one might think. And here, as elsewhere, the French Revolution marks a watershed moment. The Franco-Russian Peace of Tilsit of 1807, I think, represents a very clear-cut case of a hegemonial peace. Having been fought to a standstill by a Prusso-Russian army earlier in the year, Napoleon defeated a Russian army in mid-June before British naval power could be brought to bear on the Baltic theatre, and he was now in control of Prussia, and the Tsar agreed to make terms. They met on a tented raft in the middle of the river Niemen, with the Prussian king sort of hovering anxiously behind them as a helpless spectator. And the Peace of Tilsit of 1807, of July 1807, confirmed Napoleon's dominance in Europe, from Cadiz to Königsberg, and from the Danish Straits to the Straits of Messina. Napoleon also mediated an end to the latest Russo-Turkish war. And the treaty nevertheless provided brittle glue to cement the ties between the French and Russian empires. While Napoleon found fresh grounds for complaining that Russia was not abiding by the terms of that treaty, Alexander I grew alarmed at Napoleon's seemingly insatiable ambition. Even more clear-cut, we're moving forward by a century or so, was the Peace of Brest-Litovsk between the Central Powers and the nascent Soviet Union in March 1918. Lenin, in fact, compared that treaty with the Peace of Tilsit of 1807. It confirmed Russia's withdrawal from the war and handed Germany, at least on paper, a vast sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Brest-Litovsk also explains why no negotiated peace was possible earlier between the belligerent powers. Ultimately, the First World War was also a war of competing visions for a future international order. Now, diplomats, of course, were professionally primed to spot opportunities for negotiating to settle conflicts. Indeed, in early 1918, Sir William Tyrrell, a high-ranking diplomat in the British Foreign Office, believed that he could arrange a peace with the German foreign minister in an afternoon. Now, exploring the options of peace talks was one thing, but ultimately the positions on the battlefield real or perceived, framed the discussions of what was deemed politically possible. For as long as one side could see advantage in carrying on military operations, no real opening was feasible. Aligning military developments with the diplomatic dynamics and the interests of the belligerents was the challenge that proved impossible to meet. Sequencing the necessary diplomatic steps was key in 1916-17 and later, and President Wilson's peace initiatives fell at that hurdle. There were institutional failings in the United States that exacerbated the problem, nor was Germany better positioned as an essentially pre-modern state trying to wage a near-total war. Finally, the fifth type of war endings, the major reordering of international politics, has always attracted particular attention, and the signposts are familiar to all of us. 1648, 1815, 1919, maybe 1945. Modern international relations are generally, if somewhat lazily, thought to have commenced with the Peace of Westphalia as the foundation stone of the modern or Westphalian system. Well, actually, when you look at it, the Instrumenta Pacis of 1648 in fact consisted of three separate but connected treaties signed in a complex and carefully choreographed sequence, just as the war had in reality been a series of different but overlapping conflicts that were all rolled into one, the 30 Years' War. Nor did this war end wars for good. The Franco-Spanish War rumbled on for another 11 years, and the nearly 7 decades after Westphalia were amongst the most bellicose in European history. The Westphalian system did not perhaps establish a new European system, but it brought about important and lasting changes in great power politics. Notions of internal and external sovereignty steadily gained currency, and relations between states became more formalized, subject and regulated by international law, in aspiration at any rate, if not always in practice. The achievements of the peacemakers of 1813 and 1815 were more substantial. Castlereagh's, the British Foreign Secretary's, success in committing the Allied powers to the idea of a general peace settlement as opposed to a series of separate treaties was a significant innovation in international practice. Discrete treaties might well have ended the war earlier, but in the absence of a comprehensive European framework, they were not likely to endure. Castlereagh's second major success was more subtle. He insisted on control over the proceedings at an eventual peace congress, resting on the 4 principal European powers allied against Napoleon, with the possible addition, after the peace had been securely established, of France herself. And this was the nucleus of the 19th century concert of Europe, upon which the equilibrium, the great power equilibrium, and thus the stability of international affairs rested. The concert system was perhaps the most durable achievement of the Congress of Vienna. It must appear as the natural extension of recent practices into the future, but at the time it was a striking addition to the diplomatic methods available. Over time, the notion of holding conferences as an obligatory first stage of international crisis management became entrenched and furnished the foundation of international politics until the outbreak of the First World War, to re-emerge in the shape of the League of Nations, then the United Nations, and later still a whole plethora of bodies, of international bodies that have come into existence since the late 20th century. And it is this development that gives the Congress of Vienna its particular aura of lasting success. Now, however one looks at 1919 as a reordering of international politics, it was a highly problematic exercise. Of course, unprecedented challenges overshadowed the deliberations at Paris. The sudden end of the war and the collapse of 3 multi-ethnic empires in Eastern, Central, and Southeastern Europe and the Near East left the leaders of the victorious Allied and associate powers with a task the magnitude which staggers the imagination even at a distance of a century. Within a matter of weeks, they had to turn themselves from war leaders into peacemakers. They were not unaware of the responsibilities that this entailed, nor were they blind to the challenges that lay ahead. But they had to tackle the unresolved problems that had plunged Europe into the war in 1914 in the first place, as well as the situations created by 4 years of conflict. Yet recent experiences were too immediate, and the domestic and international pressures were too strong for them to take the long view. Matters were compounded by revolution and near-civil war in Germany, in Austria, and in Hungary, which turned an inter-allied preparatory conference into the actual peace conference. Profound differences between the big four complicated proceedings and curtailed the room for maneuver and scope for compromises. With the fundamentals of the settlement eventually established, there was nothing for the German delegation but to accept or to reject what was presented to it. This placed a double burden on the peace treaty. Inter-allied conflicts of interest meant that the inter-allied compromises were likely to endure, and translating what had become an effective warfighting coalition into a coherent political alliance for peacemaking turned out to be a difficult endeavor. Only by making often painful compromises, by accepting the provisional nature of the arrangements, and by so sacrificing the inner coherence of the settlement did the leaders salvage a peace treaty. But in doing so, they moved away from the original Wilsonian basis on which the imperial German government had sought an armistice, and therein lay a significant part of the legitimacy deficit of the subsequent peace settlement. Compared with earlier post-war periods, the international situation between 1919 and 1925 was unusual in that there was no equilibrium nor a hegemon. The Geneva system could not fill that vacuum, and yet for all its shortcomings, the League of Nations was useful as a symbol and a beacon, as one middle-ranking diplomat noted at the time. So long as it is there, it can be vivified and widened and altered as you will, but destroyed, and only the naked beast is left. Ultimately, that beast was not tamed. By the summer of 1940, Joseph Stalin could boast that and I quote, their desire to get rid of the equilibrium had created the basis for the rapprochement between him and Adolf Hitler, and that the restoration of the old equilibrium and a return to the order it represented were now impossible. Such sentiments may explain, at least in part, why there was no broad-based Vienna or Paris-style peace conference in 1945. Of course, there had been preparatory work for such a gathering, and various wartime summits and meetings had established certain parameters for post-war politics. But deep-seated security concerns, superseded by the necessity of war after 1945, re-emerged once the common enemy had been defeated. They manifested themselves in the clashes between the erstwhile allies over the future of Poland, their respective interests in Iran, Turkey, and Greece, and in the urgent problem of settling the German question. Under these adverse conditions, no general peace settlement could be arranged. A de facto settlement nevertheless emerged as the victorious powers groped their way into the future. So, how can we make sense of all of this? How to restore order after major disruptions is one of the most significant practical and conceptual challenges for international statecraft. The end of war inevitably brings with it the need for readjustments, political, territorial, and sometimes social and economic too. At that point, what would appear to be the pressing demands of the day invariably interact with often irresistible longer-term structural forces. When considering past peace settlements, it seems to me that there are four major conditions that can be identified that are crucial to the arrangements made and their eventual success or failure. Most obviously, first, the distribution of power at the moment the fighting has ended or is drawing to a close is decisive in establishing whose interest will prevail at the conference table. Secondly, far from being permanent, most, if not indeed all, peace treaties turned out to be transitional arrangements. The degree to which peacemakers understood the essential impermanence of all settlements and the degree to which they had grasped the realities of the international situation under which they had to operate was the principal reason for the success or failure of their efforts. Assumptions of permanence have always tended to lead to rigidity, inconsistencies, to early openings for revision. Equally important, this is the third condition, are the contemporary views about the causes of war just ended, for they conditioned the prescribed solution for conflict in general. If the diagnosis wasn't right, then the remedies were not likely to be efficacious either. Finally, and perhaps least significantly, there is the role of diplomacy. The ability of diplomats to make use of the options available to meet the demands of the hour were as important as their success in fashioning new methods of settling international disputes. Given all these challenges, one might be forgiven if one concluded that rulers facing the prospect of war ought to emulate the example of the Emperor Charles V, who in 1536 challenged the King of France to settle their differences by mortal combat, man against man, on land or en mer, as he put it. Alas, the king did not accept the challenge, nor are present-day rulers likely to follow the emperor's example. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. It calls an image up of President Putin and his handshakes. When we were putting the conference together, one of the things we were thinking about in terms of sequencing the historical background bit was what we call the interwar period, but it has to remember the leaders at that point didn't think it was an interwar period, and to some extent what the events were happening at the late 1930s, which we now tend to think of as preludes to the Second World War, were in fact also efforts to resolve loose threads left over from the earlier peace settlement after World War I. So this is actually one reason for asking Bruce Strang to pick up on that thread. So I'll turn over to you.
Thank you very much. Like Thomas, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at the conference. And I'd like to thank the students who have volunteered to help put on the conference, and to the hosts. This is a beautiful room to have our deliberations in today. As Erik said, I'd like to talk about the attempt in the 1930s, and the last attempt, if you will, in the 1930s to broker what the Prime Minister of Great Britain saw as an honest peace, a peace that would rectify the issues that remained left over from the failed attempt to create peace between Germany and its neighbors in Europe in 1919. And that was the Munich crisis. And so what I want to do in my session is to talk a little bit about the run-up to the Munich crisis, what was the issue at stake in the Munich crisis. And then I want to focus my discussion on Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who at the time people saw as a hero for his work at Munich, but in the history books has come to be vilified very frequently by political opponents and sometimes by political allies as a guilty man, as one of the leaders of the United Kingdom of Great Britain that failed to prepare Britain to fight the Second World War, and failed to conciliate Hitler, and failed to deter Hitler. And so in Winston Churchill's phrase, World War II was the unnecessary war. If the English peoples had had more wisdom, they would have stopped Germany before it got to the point where Hitler could have started the Second World War. And so my discussion will look at the events of Munich, and then how Neville Chamberlain tried to create a just peace at Munich, and how that failed. And then as an historian, I don't typically try to create a set of universal lessons. History is particular. Munich does not necessarily tell us great lessons about every crisis that has ever existed. But I think that at the end I will try to offer some suggestions and perhaps warnings for the practicers of diplomacy about what one might want to avoid, and to talk about some good practices for diplomats and intelligence officials and leaders of countries who are trying to settle conflict and trying to avoid war, and some poor quality practices that tend to make war likely and tend to make peace harder to maintain. So what were we talking about in the Munich crisis? Well, as Thomas Otte had talked about, it really derives from the settlement of Versailles and the associated treaties signed in Paris. And Czechoslovakia was a creation coming out of the Versailles Peace Conference, and it created a multinational country. It wasn't just Czechs and Slovaks, as the title of the country would imply, but there were also ethnic Germans. By 1938, somewhere around 3 million to 3.5 million ethnic Germans. There were Poles, ethnic Poles, fairly substantial Hungarian minority in Czechoslovakia, some Ruthenians and some sub-Carpathian Ruthenians. And so the idea of creating, as Wilson had hoped, a map where there would be a self-determination of peoples proved impossible to implement in the successor states of Eastern Europe, whether it be Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. And so the crisis came for Czechoslovakia in 1938. And the German government, since 1919, had carried out a systemic plan to evade the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. The German Foreign Ministry had created a worldwide propaganda apparatus to try to create a climate favorable for revision of Versailles. The German government had systematically sought to evade paying reparations, whether in cash or in kind. It had in fact sabotaged its own currency in the early 1920s to create a moral climate where it could blame reparations payments for damaging the German economy to the point where it had essentially ceased to function. The stories of hyperinflation, some of you may have seen pictures of German citizens burning stacks of Reichsmarks as heating fuel. And there are stories, perhaps apocryphal, of workers taking a wheelbarrow to work to collect the money in their paycheck, fill it with their stacks of bills, take it to the store to buy something, park their wheelbarrow outside the store to go in to buy something, and when they came back, someone had taken the wheelbarrow, dumped the money, and left it behind and had stolen the wheelbarrow, which had value. It systematically evaded the arms limitation agreements, creating a several 100,000 man police force who happened to wear military-style uniforms and live in barracks. It had tested and had cooperated with the Soviet Union in evading the armaments restrictions clauses. And then, of course, things accelerated when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and seized dictatorial power in the summer of 1933. The Germans eventually announced open conscription, announced the creation of the German Luftwaffe, and eventually remilitarized the Rhineland demilitarized zone in 1936. In early 1938, Germany carried out the Anschluss, the union with Austria that the Treaty of Versailles had specifically prohibited, and absorbed Austria into the German Reich. And then in the aftermath, and after a crisis that was not a crisis, the Czechs said that the Germans were preparing an invasion, which at that point the Germans were not, in fact, doing. They had carried out a mobilization and then said that the Germans had backed down in the face of this. It infuriated Hitler. He had long planned at some point he would deal with Czechoslovakia, but he ordered his military to create the plan for the invasion of Czechoslovakia that he would implement in the future. And they settled in May of 1938 that sometime in the fall they would invade Czechoslovakia. Hitler's goal, very clearly, was to invade Czechoslovakia, to conquer it, and to seize the country. However, they created a public face to this campaign, which the Germans fairly cleverly rooted in Wilsonian principles. There were millions of ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia, and they should have freedom. They should be free to join with their brethren and in Germany. And so the green areas in this map, this figure, I don't have an exact date from it. It is from the University of Wisconsin collection. It appears to me that it is from the summer or early fall of 1938. And the green areas are areas that the Germans claimed had a majority ethnic German population. And as you can see, it goes in a band all around the borders of the traditional provinces of Bohemia and Moravia that the framers of the Versailles Treaty had included in Czechoslovakia. The German population had never been asked to join. Konrad Henlein was the leader of the political party that represented ethnic Germans. In elections, the last election before this crisis, they had received 88% of the vote amongst the ethnic German population. And they had some legitimate grievances. Excuse me, I'm going to have to take a drink of water here. They had some legitimate grievances. But Hitler had instructed Konrad Henlein, their leader, to present demands that the Czechs could never agree to meet. Because ultimately he wanted an invasion, and so there was this public face to the campaign and a private military conquest plan behind the scenes. Over the summer, the public face of the crisis became more serious. There were widespread discussions that a war was about to occur over Czechoslovakia, and the various parties had to position themselves. Britain, in theory, had no direct connection with Yugoslavia, but its potential alliance partner, France, did. It had a military treaty with Czechoslovakia, and that would bind France to come to the defense of Czechoslovakia if it was the victim of unprovoked aggression. And the Soviet Union also had a treaty with Czechoslovakia that said, at Czech insistence, that if Czechoslovakia was the victim of unprovoked aggression, and France honored its treaty alliance to Czechoslovakia, then the Soviet Union would be obliged to come to Czechoslovakia's defense as well. And by 1938, September 1938, the world knew that there was a potential war coming over Czechoslovakia. Hitler had clearly mobilized his army to invade. Neville Chamberlain came up with a plan to forestall a war, and he flew to Germany and met with Adolf Hitler in Berchtesgaden on the 15th of September 1938. And we're now used to summit diplomacy, and we're now used to airplanes that can fly us across the world at a moment's notice. But this was unique. This was the first time Chamberlain, 72 years old, if I remember correctly at the time, had ever flown on an airplane. And it was unusual for the heads of government of countries to meet with one another. And so this was the beginning of what we now know as an era of summit diplomacy. Neville Chamberlain flew without a large retinue of advisors who would advise him, and he was essentially acting not only as the British Prime Minister, but his own Foreign Secretary. He met with Hitler, and they agreed that there should be a cession of these border regions, although the Germans had a slightly different map that they presented. And this is the map of the discussions in the meeting at Godesberg, which was a second meeting. And what had happened is they had discussed at Berchtesgaden that there would be this cession of ethnic German areas to Germany. But Hitler ultimately didn't want that. He didn't want a settlement. He wanted a war. So when Neville Chamberlain flew back and met with Hitler this time at Bad Godesberg, Hitler escalated his demands, said that the behavior of the Czech government was intolerable, trumped up some charges of supposed action against German citizens, and declared that he was ready to smash Czechoslovakia to liquidate it. Now, later that night, Hitler somewhat recanted and said that he could accept a cession of territory, but it had to be immediate. Neville Chamberlain, disappointed, flew back, but nevertheless met with his cabinet, and at a cabinet meeting, everybody agreed that this was going to be okay and that it was necessary to preserve the peace. But that night, the Foreign Secretary, Viscount Halifax, had to ride home from his chief civil service advisor in the Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan. And Cadogan read him the Riot Act, said that Britain was abandoning all morality and rationality. And after a sleepless night, Halifax had a conversion. And at the cabinet meeting the next day, they decided they were going to reject Hitler's Bad Godesberg terms. On the evening of the 26th and then through to the 27th of December, it looked as if a war was about to break out, and most writers who observed about international relations assumed that on the night of the 27th of September that war would occur the next day. But the British government spoke with the Italian government, Benito Mussolini, who had promised to aid Hitler if France and Britain went to war against him, sent a message to Hitler saying that Hitler could get everything that he wanted through a conference. So they eventually met in Munich, and they agreed that immediately the cross-hatched areas on the western part of the map, the brown and yellow areas, would be ceded to Germany. There were later discussions about other areas where there were questions whether or not there was a majority of Germans or Czechs in a given area. But essentially, they agreed that Czechoslovakia would have to cede a substantial part of its territory. But what's really important is that territory is largely mountainous. It's the best defensive terrain that Czechoslovakia would have. It contained about 70% of Czechoslovak heavy industry, and it contained about 70% of its electrical generating power. And so this really crippled the state of Czechoslovakia. The later sessions, the blue and yellow in the sort of middle north, was territory ceded to Poland that had an ethnic Polish enclave, and again was an area heavily involved in heavy industry. And the green and yellow in the south part of Slovakia was a later award during the so-called Vienna Awards that awarded that area to Hungary. So Czechoslovakia was shattered. Essentially, the Munich conference consisted of 4 leaders. And the leaders from left to right are Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier, who looks the most miserable of all, and then Adolf Hitler, of course, Benito Mussolini, and his foreign minister, his son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. The 4 ministers met. You'll note there are no Czechs here. There were no Soviet representatives. It was a 4-power agreement, and the others were excluded. Chamberlain went back to England and was treated as a hero. Here's a photograph of him landing at Heston, and he's brandishing a piece of paper there. And this piece of paper has become quite a famous document, and here he's holding up the piece of paper. On the 30th of September, after the conference was over, the deed was done. Czechoslovakia had been saved or betrayed, depending on how one wanted to represent it. Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in a meeting with just the 2 of them and Hitler's interpreter. And he gave him a paper to sign called an Anglo-German Declaration. And they talked about how European affairs could improve. Hitler had promised, this was his last territorial demand in Europe. They had discussed how they could wind down the Spanish Civil War. They talked about how, at Neville Chamberlain's behest, they could ban the use of bombing aircraft and create a more humane warfare. And then Chamberlain gave him this Anglo-German declaration that said, essentially, that consultation should be the method of dispute resolution between Britain and Germany, and they should resolve never to go to war against one another. Hitler took the document after being told of its contents by his interpreter, rapidly agreed to sign it and signed it right there. Chamberlain landed at Heston and, buoyed by the jubilation of the crowds, declared that this was the 2nd time in history the British Prime Minister had come back to Germany carrying peace. He called it a peace with honor, and it was peace for our time. Well, that didn't work, but just to give you a little bit of a taste here of the tremendous applause that Chamberlain received. This is...
God of the Empire's capital, let the people themselves speak what is in their heart.
So just a very brief clip, but there was a massive crowd out in front of Buckingham Palace, and the cheers for Chamberlain were so loud that the King and Queen had to invite Chamberlain and his wife onto the balcony at Buckingham Palace, which was an extraordinary thing for a commoner to take the cheers of the crowd on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. He was a hero for some, and a villain for others. But for Neville Chamberlain, this was not merely a solution to a particular crisis. And so what I want to talk about now is more generally appeasement, what Chamberlain had hoped to achieve. And I think this will give me then a platform to be able to talk about some of the potential lessons that one might learn from a situation such as Munich. So his declaration, Peace with Honor, Peace for Our Time, meant for Chamberlain this was really not just simply a resolution of the Czech crisis. He believed that he had met Hitler, he had taken the measure of the man, he had created a business-like relationship with Hitler. He believed that they could work together. And one could make an argument, and many historians have, particularly after the opening of the archives, looked at the tremendously difficult set of circumstances that the British government faced in 1938, and the French government, for its part, faced in 1938, and said that it was entirely reasonable to surrender, in a sense, at Munich, to determine that it was impossible to fight a war. I'll quote from Paul Stafford, an eminent British historian, and this is a fairly lengthy quote. If one begins to tot up all the plausible motivations for appeasement, fear and horror of another war, Britain's state of military unpreparedness, fear for the British economy and the empire, the unprepared state of public opinion, isolationism of the Dominions and the United States, the lack of confidence in France, the lack of interest in Central Europe, failure to understand Hitler and Nazism, fear and distrust of the Soviet Union and communism, the absence of a viable alternative presented either by the conservative opposition or Labour, and more, one begins to see that these are far more than enough to explain the Munich decision. It was massively overdetermined. Any other policy in 1938 would have been an astounding, almost impossible diversion from the norm. And so for a lengthy period, a couple of decades after the opening of British archives, maybe 3 decades after the opening of British archives, it was very common to explain appeasement in regards to structural constraints that had prevented any other kind of policy. But I think there are some challenges in Stafford's list, because some of those were objective structural constraints, but some of them were also perceptions and creations of the British mind. So what did Neville Chamberlain actually believe he was accomplishing at Munich? And why did he ultimately agree to go to Munich to sign this surrender of Czech territory that was an important blow against Western interests? The first is that he didn't really see that South Central Europe or Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe was a British vital interest. And this was a long-standing British belief. His older half-brother, Austen Chamberlain, at the time of Locarno, had said that Poland was not worth the bones of a British grenadier. Britain's interests lay in Western Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Far East, and in the defense of empire. And so Southeast Europe wasn't worth a British war. Many people, Neville Chamberlain included, saw Hitler's demands as essentially reasonable. These were ethnic Germans who had been denied self-determination of peoples on the grounds of Wilsonian idealism and self-determinations of people. They should be part of Germany. They clearly agitated to be part of Germany and should be allowed to do so. Neville Chamberlain also shared a widespread European belief, educated by the German Foreign Office that had created out a widespread public diplomacy against the terms of Versailles. And he believed that Versailles was unjust and that it required revision. And he wrote to one of his sisters and said that I think they have had good cause to ask for consideration of their grievances. He's referring here to the Germans. And if they had asked nicely, after I had appeared on the scene, they might already have had some satisfaction. So Neville Chamberlain saw himself not as someone reacting and merely reacting to a crisis and having to settle an imminent crisis. He saw himself as the driver of events. He, with the power and the economic power and the diplomatic cachet of Great Britain behind him, was a driver of events, not being driven, in this case, by Hitler's threat of war. And so he thought that it was important to revise Versailles and to create a durable peace that the Germans ultimately would accept. He also shared, in odd ways, some elements of Wilsonian internationalism, but in other ways believed himself to be something of a realpolitiker. He believed in the control of armaments. He thought that the armaments race that was going on in Europe, and particularly the strains of rearmament on the British economy, were ruinous. he needed to put an end to the arms race. And he hoped in particular to stop strategic bombing, to put an end to offensive bombing aircraft that could fly over and drop bombs on cities. And I'll explain in a moment why that was a particular concern of his. But at the same time, he was not a fan of the League of Nations. He saw the League of Nations and its collective security principles as potentially involving Britain in obligations that it did not want to assume. And one needs only to look at the Ethiopian crisis, of which I've written about and many others have written about, where Britain was obliged by public opinion to come to the defense of Ethiopia in a war where the Italians conquered Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936, where British interests were not well served by a policy either of opposing Italy or of supporting it in its invasion. So he believed that the League of Nations and collective security was problematic, and he also believed that simply dividing Europe again into alliances, an alliance against Germany and an alliance for Germany, would merely, as it happened in his simplistic understanding of the origins of the First World War, it would simply be more likely to create a Second World War again. He also was not a pacifist. None of the members of the British cabinet, with one possible exception, were genuinely pacifistic. But they did tremendously fear another war against Germany. They had all seen the widespread destruction of an entire generation of British youth. And many from the middle and upper classes had become subalterns who had fought in the trenches in the First World War and had been slaughtered in high numbers, and very few in Britain or in France, for that matter, wanted to see another scale of industrialized warfare like had happened in the Great War. And so he hoped at Munich to broker a peace for the long term, not merely to end this immediate crisis. But Neville Chamberlain was also the victim of a considerable degree of wishful thinking. In fact, Hitler was driving this event, not Neville Chamberlain, and Britain was reacting to events controlled largely out of Berlin. Neville Chamberlain believed passionately that European countries needed to end this arms race. It had to stop. They could not afford another great war, that this time would be worse because of the bombing of civilian populations. Great Britain now also faced a much worse strategic situation compared to the First World War, because now they feared not only fascist Italy, that Britain had alienated in part through its opposition to Italy's invasion of Abyssinia and Britain's support for the League of Nations, but Japan in the Far East was threatening British imperial interests at the time, primarily in China, and the extensive British economic position in China, and of course then Germany in Northwest Europe. And Britain could not afford to build a navy and an air force big enough to challenge all three of those combatants, and so they had considerable imperial overreach. And he also had an overwhelming belief in his own intelligence and intellectual superiority. He, I think it's fair to say, always thought of himself as being the smartest man in the room, whatever the room might be. He also felt that of the potential allies for England, that they were all, in one way or another, unreliable. The French were unreliable because they were, in fact, French, and they also, in fact, failed to build a sufficient air force. And Neville Chamberlain believed very strongly in building a powerful RAF to defend Great Britain against potential German attack. And the French government was considerably behind in its air rearmament campaign. So France was a potential ally, but it was twitchy and unreliable in Chamberlain's view. He saw the United States as faithless. He and Roosevelt did not have a good working relationship. And of course, the United States, under the influence of the neutrality laws, if a war had broken out over Munich, the United States would have been obliged to impose an embargo against all sides. Neville Chamberlain believed that he could perhaps wean Italy away from the Rome-Berlin axis and had signed an agreement with Italy at Easter in 1938. And he hoped that that accord could be implemented in the aftermath of Munich. It hadn't been because of technical negotiations that had occurred, and they hoped to implement the Anglo-Italian Easter Accords that would potentially cause Mussolini to draw back from his association with Hitler. And ultimately, he wanted to end aerial bombardment. And that was one of his critical hopes at Munich and in the discussions with Hitler in Munich and afterwards. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that for a couple of minutes if I have time. People in the 1930s thought of aerial bombardment the way we today do of nuclear war. There were newspaper articles written where people forecast what a post-World War II landscape might look like. And it would be bombed out cities where people lived in bunk holes, tunneling out of rubble. The British government and British military had carried out a study that Neville Chamberlain knew that said, a very simple calculation, the Germans were capable of dropping about 600 tons of bombs on London in a given day. And they estimated that a given ton of bombs would cause 50 casualties. So if you do a very simple mathematical calculation, that comes to 30,000 casualties a day. About a quarter of those would die. About 3/4 would be injured. But you can imagine the scale of destruction when one thinks that's 30,000 in a day. So in a month of aerial bombardment, you're looking at 900,000. In 2 months, you're looking at 1.8 million. This is a catastrophe of untold proportions. And yes, it might be worthwhile facing that kind of damage if the issue were important enough. But he didn't see Czechoslovakia as being important enough to subject Britons to that kind of carnage. Harold Nicholson, a Labour MP who was not part of the national government and was in fact a staunch political opponent of Neville Chamberlain, confessed that although he detested the Munich terms, that he had gone to sleep on the evening of September the 28th, pleased that he wouldn't be suffering under a rain of German bombs that night. And Britain was not in a good position to fight a war. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. I'm sorry, there we go. This was Britain's primary defensive fighter aircraft in 1938. They had started to build the Hurricane fighter, and they had 4 squadrons of Hurricane fighters, so typically 48 fighters, available at the time of Munich in 1938. But within 6 to 12 months, they were going to have a raft of new single-wing, metal-hulled monoplane fighters coming into production, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, that of course won the Battle of Britain. But this would have been their fighter aircraft. And they were going to replace it with this fighter aircraft, a dramatic new generation of aircraft. And Neville Chamberlain himself said to his cabinet as he flew back from Bad Godesberg that he couldn't counsel rejecting Hitler's extreme terms at Bad Godesberg because as he flew over London, he looked down and saw the city spread below him, and he realized that he couldn't defend his citizens against German aerial bombardment. And that figure that I gave you assumed that Germany would not use gas warfare. If Germany used gas bombs, then those casualty figures would escalate. Now, in retrospect, they were entirely wrong. So, air bombardment wasn't nearly as damaging. Britain was able to survive many months of bombardment through the Blitz, and massive, massive numbers of American and British bombers flew over Germany and pummeled its cities. They never inflicted anywhere near the kinds of casualties that they thought. But for Neville Chamberlain, there was another issue. And that is that if you see the purple Czechoslovakia there in 1939, and see to its northeast, there's Poland, and then you see to the southeast, there's Romania, and the Soviet Union is more than 100 miles away. The Soviets had pledged that they would come to Czechoslovakia's support, but they couldn't actually get there. And assessments of the British government were that the Soviets would be able to provide no help, no effective help to the Czechs because of the purges, because of their poor logistics, because of the lack of command and control, because the railroad gauge changed at the border. The railroads, the locomotives ran on different width railroads. The Soviets would not be able to project force along their borders. And so Czechoslovakia was isolated. France and Britain together planned to fight and win World War II through a concept called la guerre de longue durée, the war of long duration. And that was that industrialized warfare required massive numbers of troops, massive amounts of war materiel, Britain and France faced a population and an industrial deficit against Germany in the first days of the war. They would fight a roughly 2-year defensive action in the West. They would close an economic blockade of Germany while they mobilized the resources of the British dominions and the French colonial empires and the British Empire, and then they would be able to carry out a grand offensive to destroy Germany after 2 years. But for the first 2 years, they could do effectively nothing to save Czechoslovakia. The most pessimistic forecast is that the Czech military would be defeated within 6 weeks. The most optimistic was that it would take 6 months. And all the while, London and Paris would potentially be subjected to German bombs. So there were tremendously strong structural reasons, constraints on British policy. But at the same time, Neville Chamberlain also was deluded in his thinking. He had no influence over Hitler. In fact, Hitler detested him and had genuine contempt for Neville Chamberlain, as British intelligence showed in the aftermath of Munich. So Munich then was a kind of Satan's bargain, if you will. Britain and France surrendered an important ally, surrendered important strategic elements of a potential war-fighting alliance against Germany for their own short-term benefit. But Neville Chamberlain didn't just see it in those draconian terms. He genuinely believed that he could create a peace that would endure. He could settle the war, and he alone, a man of destiny, would be able to settle the affairs of Europe, to revise Versailles that would create a genuine peace for Europe. So I have several tentative lessons, if you will, from Munich. I don't claim that they're universally applicable, but they, I think, are broadly applicable. But because they are broadly applicable, they're also fairly broad in their conception. So the first is that Versailles and the 2 decades-long German campaign for revision shows the tremendous ability of even a defeated power to resist a peace treaty that it does not want to uphold. And it's not always simplistic for the so-called victorious powers to be able to coerce the acceptance and the performance of the conditions of a peace treaty. In fact, it can be extraordinarily difficult. In this age of summit diplomacy, I think it's wise to beware the single decision maker who thinks that he's the smartest person in the room. In recent American presidential history in the 21st century, I would suggest that there are probably 3 of the presidents who never were the smartest man in the room. But then one of those presidents almost assuredly thought that he was the smartest man in the room, suggests that decision-making by a single decision-maker can be highly chaotic and can be brilliant and audacious and effective on occasion, but it also can be catastrophically wrong. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows the perils of a dictatorial decision-making structure. Third, beware the prime minister or the president or the minister who reads an opponent, who looks across a table into the eyes of his opponent, who trusts the opponent and thinks that they can do business together. Evidence shows that leaders are no more capable than others of spotting deception, though they often assume that they are. In my part-time job, I do some labor arbitration, and one of the very first things I was taught as a potential arbitrator is don't assume you can tell when someone is lying to you. Judges, arbitrators are no better at doing that than anyone else. So what is the solution? It's listen to the evidence. Listen to all of the evidence, and don't make snap judgments on personal judgment. Intelligence information can be critical, but it needs to be accurate intelligence. It needs to be interpreted properly, and then the decision makers need to be receptive to its message. And they can't have created an intelligence service geared towards delivering only a certain message, as I would argue it happened, for example, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. Cabinet decision-making can be effective, but it's also vulnerable to groupthink, as are intelligence services. So information gathering and learning the lessons of history, applying modern intelligence is often exceedingly difficult. Use evidence to assess credibility. Above all, avoid wishful thinking. when making policy, because even if you think it must be so, it perhaps is telling you that you want it to be so, so badly that you are misinterpreting the evidence so that you can make a justification in your own mind that something you want to happen, in fact, will happen. Beware imperial overreach, stretching one's military defense abilities beyond their, your obligations beyond your ability actually to meet them. The failure of the Anglo-French, American, and Italian coalition that Thomas had referred to in his talk is an important lesson. Coalitions are hard to create. They're hard to create to stop a war from occurring, as happened in Europe before the Second World War. They're sometimes difficult to create, even during a war. And then they're often even harder to keep together after the war is done and when one turns to peacemaking. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks again to the organizers for inviting me, and I hope that this can provide some food for thought as we look beyond the historical and turn to looking at present-day crises. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.